Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Before we proceed to the second plenary session, there are several announcements that the committee would like to inform.
We have two vendors that are waiting for you to visit. One is the batik stand on the first floor and Sanata Dharma bookshop here on the fourth floor.
And if you intend to purchase batik, you can visit Lesung Batik booth on the ground floor of this building. And if you need further assistance, please contact the committee.
Besides book from Sanata Dharma Press, you will also find Dasamuka by Junaidi Setiono, which has been translated into English. You can find both versions in the bookshop stand, and the author and translator will be at the stand during lunch at the second Literary Studies Conference for autographing.
And the last announcements, don't forget to visit our Instagram account at LSC Sadar, LSCSADHAR, for photos for this conference. And thank you for your attention.
Ladies and gentlemen, now we will continue our meeting to the next agenda. That is to hear the second plenary session, which will be delivered by Ibu Lian Gouw from Dalang Publishing. The second plenary session will be moderated by Dr. Sri Mulyani.
Bu Sri Mulyani, the floor is yours.
Welcome back to this room. So now we're going to have a great talk by our honorable guest speaker, Ibu Lian Gouw. She is the founder of Dalang Publishing House that focuses on making the English translation of Indonesian historical and cultural novels available to the larger readers in the world, right? And you can also check and buy the books in the hall there, right? I've already had the copy of her work, Only a Girl, right? And some of other books that you can buy there. Right? Ibu Lian Gouw has written a very eloquent piece to narrate her life story and life history in the article that you can read in the proceeding. So I would not really introduce her because that would really belittle the thing that actually she has prepared. So I would let her to narrate it to you in person, okay? So now, please, friends, participants, and colleagues, help me welcome our distinguished speakers, Ibu Lian Gouw.
Thank you, Moderator, for a very generous welcome. And thank you, everyone, for being here. Do you hear me, or is this microphone not working? Is it better? Yes. Okay, all right. So let me see what we are doing here. I hate these things. Is it okay now? Yes. All right, thank you very much. Thank you very much for being here this afternoon. And I especially like to thank the board of the conference for the honor of inviting me to share my thoughts and experiences as an Indonesian Diasporan author and publisher. Ever since I received Dr. Anggrani's, where is Dr. Anggrani? There she is. Anggrani's generous invitation in late January of this year, I have been living with the word diaspora buzzing in the back of my mind and trying to find the answers to the questions that the word evoked. What does being an Indonesian diasporan mean to me? While the original word was used to describe the dispersion of the Jewish people from the Holy Land, the word diaspora now refers to communities of people who live outside their country of origin, but maintain, nurture, if you will, ties with the same. Thus labeling myself with the word diasporan rather than immigrant allow me to feel a certain sense of belonging to my country of origin that I didn't have before. When did the transformation from being an immigrant to being a diasporan occur for me? What caused it to happen? And how does this change affect my thinking, my actions, my life? Reading through the suggested topic list the conference board provided, the line national identity and post-colonial instability caught my attention. The line stirred memories and pulled up long-buried issues. I am a perfect product of Dutch colonial upbringing, and my mother tongue is Dutch. Thus, I was directly affected when President Sukarno, Indonesia's first president, decreed in 1956 that the new independent Republic of Indonesia, Bahasa Indonesia, was not only the official language, but would be also the only one tolerated. I was in my 20s when in the 1950s, I found myself suddenly having to deal with the following realities. I am Chinese. My family told me that. I live in Indonesia, and that's a straight fact. And yet, I feel an ingrained, fierce national loyalty and attachment to the Dutch, which is a result of my family raising me the best way possible during that time. Yes, I am familiar with post-colonial instability. The words remind me of a time that no one prepared me for while growing up. The time when my orderly world of doing the best I could today while building a secure tomorrow was turned upside down by what was referred to as the playing out of world politics and entering an era of enlightenment. While none of this ever presented a problem while I was growing up, everything became a huge problem that today would be labeled post-colonial instability, as it was caused by the ending of centuries of Dutch colonial rule over Indonesia. For the first time in my life, identity became a problem. Being was no longer enough. It needed an explanation. Why am I Chinese? Is blood enough to claim belonging? Nothing had ever prompted me to question being Chinese. For that matter, nothing prompted me to question being anything. While growing up, I was instructed in behavioral norms for good Chinese girls. I celebrated the Chinese New Year rituals and consumed Chinese food. Not until the post-colonial era did national identity become an issue, and being became an area that demanded exploring. As a result of my Dutch-centric upbringing, I was not able to communicate on a meaningful level in any language other than Dutch, and I felt gagged by the changes the Indonesian government was making. And after watching Dutch books being burned and becoming the object of antagonism myself, I felt violated. As I said goodbye to the Dutch teachers and friends who were being ousted by the implementation of new Indonesian government rules, I felt abandoned. My solution to end this miserable living situation was simply to leave. However, my husband, who grew up with a total different Dutch experience than I had, refused to move to Holland. But finally, he agreed to move to America. And in the early 1960s, I left Indonesia with my husband and 2 children to immigrate to the United States of America. I was reacting to the political changes of our young country with useful ignorance and self-centeredness, determined to continue my life free of any kind of oppression. And ironically, I ignored the fact that millions had been freed from centuries of a far worse oppression than I had ever experienced. I arrived at the San Francisco airport filled with the hope, determination, and goodwill it takes to be a good immigrant. Assimilation is a big word when living the immigrant experience. Yet, perhaps, unknowingly, an immigrant who comes from a colonial background has lived with the concept all his life. As all his life, he has been forced to accept and absorb the culture and the norms of the colonialists. For me, assimilation into the American society was a breeze. Due to my Dutch education and upbringing, I was conversant in English and accustomed to the Western way of life. With no communication or food problems, I was able to easily earn a useful and respected place in my new environment. Identity thugs were not caused by feeling uncomfortable in my environment, but by being caught by surprise and without a ready answer to questions about my origin by curious bystanders. Questions prompted by my Dutch accent. Why is your mother tongue Dutch while you're Chinese and come from Indonesia? And questions prompted by my emphatic claim to being Chinese in response to people pegging me Indonesian. How come you don't speak any Chinese? And further probing on this issue, which part of China does your family come from? And when did they immigrate to Indonesia? Questions that made me very uncomfortable, as I only had mumbled answers for them. When my children were required to bring food to school on Heritage Day, I found myself floundering, and I finally settled on producing a staple contribution of fried wontons and fried noodles. And during those early immigrant years, I tried hard to anchor myself in being American with the same sense of belonging and loyalty I once felt toward the Dutch. But I was unsuccessful, despite my engagement in several community activities and several civic causes. Perhaps the regimented and unwavering Dutch way of life I was used to lent itself to feeling anchored, while the loose, almost unorderly multitude of choices available in an American lifestyle often created confusion and a feeling of chaos. At moments like experiencing Yosemite National Park for the first time, or driving along the California coast, or standing in the theater ticket line on Times Square in New York, I could not escape from feeling awed by the enormity of supposedly being a part of it all, of actually having a rightful claim to all of it by having acquired an American passport. I say supposedly because I never really felt that kind of belonging or entitlement. At moments like that, I was merely grateful for being allowed to experience a piece of the American dream. For years, moments like that would cause me to wonder why, while standing in awe at the foot of Yosemite's El Capitan, I'm simply filled with awe for God's creation, but cannot find any pride or the comforting sense of belonging inside me. A feeling that says, this is my country, and that cliff represents its strengths. When I bury my feet in the warm sand of a Maui beach and lie in the ocean's fluid embrace, enter its sacred, colorful silence under the surface, I feel nurtured and blessed, but not anchored. I think I can best describe the feeling of not belonging by sharing the opposite experience. When the mud of the Salatiga River oozes between my toes, when I float in the Banda Sea, or when I touch an old banyan tree, or when I sit on the steps of the Borobudur with the morning fog wrapped around me, a feeling of deep content and belonging fills my being. And I know I belong. During these experiences, all my senses affirm that in this soil I root, and in this water I find rest, and this tree's shade I find comfort. It is these people's wisdoms and rituals I turn to when shaken. Until 2011, my house and garden were the only places in America where I felt anchored. Without a longing for any certain place beyond my household environment, I was merely a floater. My children's marriages to Americans came as a natural consequence of my husband's and my choice to immigrate to America. Hopefully, our assimilation into the American society during their formative years has enabled them to be an integral part of a nation they grew up in, with a sense of loyalty to a government and a society that provided them with opportunities to situate themselves comfortably. I have always had a love for language and wanted to be a published writer. Small bites of success, such as winning the first prize in school and local paper writing contests, having my writing published in the school and youth organization magazines, fed my desire and dreams. However, life kept interfering, and I had to bide my time to pursue my dream to become a writer until my children were settled into their lives. During the years of waiting, I had taken it for granted that I would write in Dutch. I had always written in Dutch and expected the stories I was filled with to spill onto the page in Dutch. And it was therefore a terrifying experience when, in the early 90s, I finally sat down to write, and there were no words to fill the page. Some 30 years of distance caused by no longer voraciously reading Dutch books and only speaking Dutch when I wanted to tell my husband something that was not meant to be heard by the children had dried up my well of words. I still felt the stories inside me, but I could not find the words to verbalize them. It was as if I were struck dumb. However, I now lived in the land of opportunities, where dreamed futures turned into a reality, and nothing was impossible. I knew that if I wanted to write in English, I needed much more than a working command of the language. And well into my 60s, I went back to college to study creative writing. My efforts were rewarded when some of my short stories were accepted by literary magazines, while the big story brewed. And by now, I was a grandmother, and life had granted me the opportunity to experience different segments of womanhood. And I wanted to write about the dynamics between women in a family. And it took me by surprise when my story came to me from Indonesia, a place I had turned my back on decades ago. However, my writer's instinct told me to listen and record the story as it unfolded into a novel, Only a Girl. I felt rewarded when editors of note agreed to work with me on the manuscript. And I was surprised when one of them informed me that because historical events impacted my characters and drove the storyline, I had written a historical novel. I still dedicated my work to the sisterhood of women with whom I share the joys, loves, hopes, sacrifices, and pains that live in a woman's heart and that mold a woman's life. Only a Girl was published in the United States by Publish America in 2009. The work found its way to public and university libraries, book clubs, and several bookstores in the San Francisco Bay Area. To date, Only a Girl has been used as curriculum reading in Indonesian studies courses in UC Berkeley, as well as several other universities around the world. It also has been used as dissertation material by several doctoral students in Indonesian studies. And then, in 2010, Gramedia Pustaka Utama, the largest Indonesian publishing house, bought the Indonesian rights of Only a Girl and published the Indonesian language translation under the title Menantang Phoenix. And just off here on the side, don't ask me about the title. Throughout my book tour, if people would say, what is it? I'd say, Orang Gramedia, di mana? Tolong ini nih. I was invited to do a book tour, and after having been gone for some 50 years, I returned to Indonesia as an American author championing and chaperoning her work. When the wheels of the plane touched Indonesian ground on the landing strip, I felt a jolt of excitement. I was eager to set out on a new adventure, that of a published and translated author. I was bringing my story back to the soil from which it had sprouted. Little did I know how much would change during the course of 1 month. As I traveled across Java on the book tour, I paid attention to my environment, and I was perplexed with the overall changes that had taken place during my absence of half a century. At the time I left, changes from Dutch to Indonesian had been made, along with the change of Dutch street names into Indonesian ones. Hotel Indonesia was new, and in 1962, it was the first Indonesian international hotel and the tallest building in Jakarta. The road to Kebayoran was the only highway. But looking at my surroundings in the fall of 2010, high-rises filled Jakarta's skyline, and advertisements, billboards, and storefronts were written in Indonesian. But reading the various marketing copy, I noticed how much of the Indonesian text contained English words in one form or another. And along the same lines, I noticed the English titles on the covers of Indonesian books in the bookstores. And when I listened in to conversations, I often caught the sound of English. Dutch had definitely vanished and was replaced by Indonesian. However, still anchored in my Dutch upbringing that taught me to always and only speak proper Dutch, I could not help but notice all the English scattered throughout, littering the landscape of Bahasa Indonesia. And I remember President Sukarno's speeches about independence and nationalism and the right of a nation to speak its own language and govern its own people and land. And as I noticed the stark contrast between the glitzy high-rises and the slums right at the entrance of their driveways, I remembered the blaring radio announcements of President Sukarno's forecasts of pending prosperity now that Indonesia had rid itself from the Dutch colonialists. And I began to wonder, what happened to Indonesia's prosperous independence? People had died, and others, including myself, had to leave for it. What I saw did not make sense. I was confused and kept looking for an answer when suddenly I felt a shift in my thinking. I noticed that I no longer thought of the locals as them, nor did I see the countryside merely as lush, tropical greenery, the way a tourist might. By the end of the month, my inner dialogue had changed from they need to fix that problem to we need to fix that problem. The rich, lush, tropical greenery whispered stories and brought back the sound of crickets and frogs at night and made me look for fireflies. Wakening with the bird song of the perkutut and crowing roosters was peaceful, while the sound of the drum and chanting coming from a mosque announcing daybreak gave me an odd feeling of familiarity and belonging, while at the same time it stirred up a new sense of awareness. I wondered how, while living the life I lived back then, I could have been oblivious to colonial injustice and poverty that must have existed. I wondered why, after all those years of struggle, after all the bloodshed and loss of so many lives, we, not they, apparently still succumbed to the notion that anything foreign is better and let so much English creep into the language. At the end of the book tour, when my plane lifted from the Indonesian runway at takeoff, I looked out of the window and it suddenly hit me. I was leaving a part of me behind. Filled with the kindness and warmth that is home, I also felt an acute new awareness of a potent urge to factually claim, protect, and advocate for what is rightfully ours as a nation, our independence within the realms of humanity. I battled a wave of guilt for having lived for more than 6 decades in some state of unconsciousness. Upon my return to America, I resumed marketing Only a Girl and started writing my second novel. The marketing progress made me investigate how much literature about Indonesia the public libraries offered, and the lack of representation of Indonesian authors caught me off guard. Pramudia's books were the only ones in most catalogs. Reading the English translations of Pramudia's work made me want to read the novels in Indonesian, and I dove headlong into an intensive study of Bahasa Indonesia. Weekly tutoring sessions through Skype with Mas Agung from the Yogyakarta-based Language Institute, Wisma Bahasa, for nearly 3 years helped me get a grasp on the language. And these experiences led to what I consider to be my real homecoming, and resulted in the founding of Dalang Publishing in the fall of 2011. Dalang is the Indonesian word for master storyteller or puppeteer. At first, Dalang's mission was to remedy the lack of Indonesian historical fiction available to the average American reader and fulfill my need to bring those stories to America, as well as to provide the Indonesian writer and translator with a platform to launch their work internationally. My target audiences were individuals who frequent libraries and scholars with a special interest in Indonesia. Lately, I feel an expansion in my focus. My interactions with geographically displaced Indonesian youth especially have awakened the echo of President Sukarno's warning. Jangan sekali-kali melupakan sejarah. Don't ever forget history, which resounds in the statement of our own Junaidi Setiawan, the author of Dasamuka, our most recent publication, who says in his author's statement, I write historical fiction because I not only want to present the beauty of language in the form of a story, I also want my readers to appreciate what happened to their ancestors when preparing for their own future. Historical fiction written by indigenous authors of the subject country could be illustrative of that country. Historical fiction offers stories of normal people's lives that tell how they react to the drama of war and natural disaster, socio-political unrest, and economic depression, about the kind of art they produce, or the food and the drink they consume. All of this will help the reader know and understand the characters, as well as introduce them to a different culture in an often faraway land. At first, Dalang's translation merely aimed to serve the purpose of enabling a foreigner to understand the Indonesian native story. However, recently, it occurred to me that considering the current mobility people enjoy and the multicultural or international education opportunities, translation can be a powerful tool for individuals trying to find their way home. Translation definitely serves as a valuable tool for cultural exchanges between different countries. And more often than not, the protagonist of a work of fiction reflects the character of the author and represents the author's psyche. Reading Diaspora writing on a deeper than surface level, I am discovering many elements that Diaspora consciously or unconsciously are dealing with on a daily basis. First and foremost is the issue of finding and establishing identity. Individuals of various walks of life over time have discovered that writing provides a safe venue for self-discovery. And in my opinion, the truth that lies in the saying, if we are not part of the solution, we are part of the problem. It definitely applies to Diaspora. We are fortunate to live in this age of readily available literature, as reading enables us not only to enter distant, wondrous worlds, it also gives us the opportunity to reach far back into time. By merely turning the pages of a book, we are able to connect to our history and make some sense of how and why we are here. This conference has urged me to start a conversation with my grandchildren about national identity. It suddenly became important to me to touch base with them and explore their claims on identity. As I interact with them, I often wonder, are they a part of my American dream come true? What's theirs? In 1931, James Truslow Adams, in his book, The Epic of America, says, life should be better and richer and fuller for everyone, with opportunity for each, according to ability or achievement, regardless of social class or circumstance of birth. And I suddenly wondered how the American dream fits into President Sukarno's dreams for the nation. He guided to independence with the warning, jangan sekali-kali melupakan sejarah. Don't ever forget history. How important is the history of one's roots to the first generation of hybrids? How do they trace their origins, other than through genealogy charts? Perhaps this question has given Dalang Publishing an additional purpose. Perhaps, aside from introducing Indonesian literature to Western readers, our stories can also serve as a source of information to the immigrant who has strayed far away from home, and the generation after him, the hybrid generation, sometimes referred to as the lost generation. While on this subject, I cannot move on without mentioning a dilemma specific to Chinese Indonesian diaspora, who, aside from the aforementioned hurdles, are often faced with a problem inherent to their sector of diaspora. It is the phenomenon of bearing a name, yet remaining a stranger to others and one's self. I'm referring to the fact that history, so the story has it, forced many Chinese Indonesians to take on Indonesian names, while in fact, many of them did not have any conscious emotional attachment to Indonesia as a country. While most of these folks will strongly claim their Chinese identity, confusion has crept into the minds of many of their children who live outside of Indonesia. These are youths who bear an Indonesian name and look Chinese, but master neither the Indonesian nor the Chinese language. Drawing a blank on the passing of time in a historical sense, they wind up facing the enormous task of finding their way in the confusing chaos of an ethnic no man's land. They have no direct personal experience of the stepping stones used by the previous generations to pass through a zigzag of cultural shifts that were never visible to them. These youths, the hybrids, the international students, these readers have become an important part of Dalang's expanded focus. In preparation for this conference, I spoke with several Indonesian students currently studying in the United States. First, I was surprised and sad to hear that they preferred reading Dalang's English translation of Indonesian novels over reading the original work. I was equally sad to notice how much borrowed English vocabulary had crept into their Indonesian conversations. After understanding and accepting the need to replace Dutch with Indonesian, and experiencing my awakened national concern and pride, I do not want to hear English elbowing its way into the Indonesian language, including individual words politely sandwiched between proper Indonesian prefixes and suffixes. Berkomunikasi, me-focus. To my ear, this sounds mangled, and in a way, it stabs at my heart, while leaving me wondering, what then is accomplished by the individuals who, trying to find mobility and practice diversity, when they are losing their language during the journey? I know languages borrow words from each other, but witnessing this use of borrowed English words in Indonesian speech makes me anxious. My own experience of language is that it provides a sense of belonging and a way to express national pride. I feel the domino effect of the erosion of our language, and with that, the erosion of our national identity and the erasing of history. I brought this up to several students and was not able to extract any answer other than an astonished look and some mumbles. I find it fascinating that in today's global environment, which produces bilingual inhabitants, language is still a placeholder in the areas of identification and belonging. Perhaps this notion was on President Sukarno's mind when he proclaimed Bahasa Indonesia to be Indonesia's official national language. He undoubtedly realized the great need to somehow unify the 17,508 some islands wrapped around the equator with 250 million inhabitants who are divided into some 300 ethnic groups who speak about 750 different dialects. As a publisher of English language translations of Indonesian historical and cultural novels, I find there is a myriad of elements to be mindful of. For example, aside from the immediate and obvious need to consider synchronicity of meaning, rhythm of sounds, syntax, and substance of language, there are the questions of how much leeway needs to be allowed in the transmission of one set of expressive sensibilities into another. Working mainly with translations from Indonesian language into the English language, I am constantly confronted with the difference between the Western and Indonesian ways of expression, which in turn reflect their respective ways of thinking and acting, and is expressed in their writing. One of the main differences is that Westerners, compared to Indonesians, are more direct and time-conscious. Writing is done in the active voice, with an economy of word use in mind. On the other hand, Indonesian writing tends to use the passive voice and engages in leisure description. This then brings up the concepts and assumptions we have about the qualities of a native speaker versus a non-native speaker. Who would be more qualified to produce an accurate translation into English? A native or non-native speaker of English? By definition, a native speaker is an individual who has known the language since he was an infant, rather than having had to learn it at some point in his life. Long ago, one's mother tongue or native language was a language spoken in the country where one was born. However, in today's global environment, a young child might very well be simultaneously exposed to several languages and grow into the one of the many polyglots in our society. Being multilingual today can come quite naturally. A child of biracial parents who hold on to their original ethnic and cultural background will automatically grow up with two languages and two different cultures. Now, if those parents immigrated from their respective countries, the language and culture of the host country would have to be added, and this child would be exposed to 3 languages and cultures at birth. How would the notion of mother tongue and native speaker apply to such an individual? Could the notion of native speaker be applied to this individual, who would most likely be labeled as a hybrid national? Today, English is arguably one of the most common international languages, and as such, English has infiltrated most other languages to different degrees. We see this in the English words that are borrowed into other languages and the displacement of some of the native words, especially in the speech of the younger generations. As an Indonesian diasporan in the United States, especially after having made my own surprising discovery of homeland during an uncharted journey of the heart and learning the Indonesian language so eagerly, I have a strong negative physical reaction to hearing English loanwords being adopted unnecessarily into the Indonesian language. From a logical, everyday life economical point of view, borrowing is only done out of necessity, with the idea of the ability to pay back the loan after having reaped its benefit. Unnecessary borrowing is frowned upon. I know this idea does not comport with linguistic theory, but using borrowed words while there are several native words available, to me, feels like unnecessary borrowing money. To my ear, there's also an inkling of desired prestige in the use of some English borrowings. And I wonder, is this really worth it if it means betraying your country and dishonoring your own language? The irony is, I recognize that my attitude towards the use of borrowed English words parallels colonial thought and behavior. My attempt to convince locals to use Bahasa Indonesia the way I like to see it used seems no different from colonial intrusion. However, the ground I stand on is complicated. I am haunted by the following inner dialogue. Did I lose all of my birthrights, including being allowed to feel a sense of belonging, coupled with a fierce loyalty towards Indonesia, when I immigrated to the United States? While I regard my annual trips to Indonesia as going home, am I, in fact, by my fellow Indonesians, reduced to being just an American visiting Indonesia? I do not feel that I am just a visitor. In my heart and mind, I am Indonesian, chasing after the Indonesian dream of complete independence. However, I cannot help but wonder, is a homecoming of the heart enough to earn back the privilege of being considered a part of the Indonesian population? I don't know. Only time will tell. Meanwhile, working with the Indonesia-based authors, translators, publishers, academics, and government personnel, in other words, educated adults, and not just the youth, I hear all these parties fluidly incorporate many English borrowings into their speech. My linguist friends assure me this borrowing is a normal process in any vibrant living language in which the speakers regularly come into contact with another language. But I struggle with the resistance to it, and I will not pretend to accept it. I feel compelled to ask every one of these parties, are you aware of those English words creeping in? Do you care? Do you realize that by your practice of the language, you might forget the true Indonesian expressions? Don't you feel something is slipping away from you? Do you ever want to ask everyone to please stop this from letting it happen? This vexing problem will not be resolved for me anytime soon. And so, remembering Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. saying, our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. I will continue to strive to use the Indonesian words whenever available instead of English borrowings. And I will continue to bring the heavy infiltration of English into our language to people's attention. Additionally, as an Indonesian diasporan, I feel that it is my responsibility to my homeland to maintain its language and treat it with due respect, which in my humble opinion means to speak Indonesian using as many of the true Indonesian words as possible without using English borrowings. And while, as an immigrant parent, I had furthered this connection with Indonesia by complete assimilation into the American life and culture that included an exclusive use of the English language, I now, as a diasporan grandmother, try to catch up by introducing my grandchildren to Indonesian culture and history, hoping they will forgive me for having robbed them of their cultural heritage, and that they will try to understand and support my feverish attempt to make good to my country. My effort to contribute to Indonesia as well as to America are manifested in the enlarged focus of Dalang Publishing. While Dalang has focused on introducing Indonesian voices to America, This conference has made me look at what Indonesian diaspora and voices in America have to share with the folks back home about their journey as a diasporan. Unfortunately, among at least 100,000 Indonesian diaspora in the United States, I've so far only been able to come up with names of 9 authors, including myself. And I was able to find the writings of 7 of them. And in closing, I would like to briefly introduce their voices to you. I'm going to start with someone who has his roots in Yogyakarta. Inusanto Nagara is a graphic designer and a children's book author. You can see his books right there. Inu was born in Jakarta in 1970 and arrived in the United States in 1988. He has 4 books to his name. A is for Activist, was published in 2013 and has been translated in Spanish and Swedish. Counting on Community was published in 2015. My Night in the Planetarium in 2016, and The Running Portrait is being published as I'm standing here. He has his launch today. Inu is the son of renowned Yogyakarta painter, movie actor, dissident poet, and playwright Ika Nagara. Who knows of him here? Good, I'm glad. An American linguist, educator, and activist, K. Glassburner Ika Nagara. Inu came to California in 1988 to study zoology in UC Davis, but instead turned into a graphic designer and is the founding member of Design Action Collective that operates in Oakland, California, under the motto, serving the movement for social change. Through his books, Inu imparts to the children the idea of empowerment to make change. The right and the responsibility to speak out, as well as the strength and safety of community. From A is for Activist. I stands for Indigenous and Immigrant. Together, we stand tall. Our histories are relevant. Injury to one is injury to all. Next is Cynthia Devi Oka, a young poet. Cynthia was born in Denpasar in 1985. She arrived in the United States via Canada in 2012. She has 2 books of poetry to her name. Nomad of Salt and Hard Water was published in 2012 and reissued in 2016. Salvage, a book of poems, has recently been released. Originally pursuing visual arts, Cynthia turned to poetry and now integrates her training as a pianist and political theorist in her writing. Her poems, in her own words, are versions of wholeness, sorted out of broken things. Her connection to Indonesia is apparent in the lines that speak of the country's landscapes and the history, as well as recall national events that have impacted her life. Next, we have novelist Erik Setiawan. Erik was born in Jakarta in 1975 and arrived in the United States in 1991. His one novel, Of Bees and Mist, was published in 2009 and has been translated in Spanish, Dutch, and Chinese. While Erik graduated from Stanford with a master's degree in computer science, he felt compelled to write. Of Bees and Mist is Erik's expression of his struggle to make sense out of the world he grew up in. Erik chose magical realism as a vehicle to illustrate the intrigue and complicated relationships in a family set in a society that still believes in witchcraft, spirits, and demons. Rentani Atmodi is a short story writer. Born in Padang in 1969, she arrived in the United States in 1999. She has 2 short stories completed, A Foothold in Foreign Soil, and one in Indonesian, Selendang Bersulam Putih. While Rentani has a PhD in mechanical engineering, While Rentani has a PhD in mechanical engineering, her deep love for language has made her an avid reader and gave her the courage to mind the right side of her brain. She is a bilingual, aspiring short story writer with 2 completed stories in respectively English and Indonesian. And despite her 18-year-long stay in America, Rentani's writing reflects her strong connection to Indonesia. A Foothold in Foreign Soil talks about trying to give reason to immigration, a longing for a better life. The triumph of achieving something toward that goal is illuminated when she writes that her protagonist, Sukma, after passing her final defense, exclaims, "I am free, free. No more research, no more work, no more deadlines, no more pressure. I'll have my whole life back and fly into this world." Now, Selendang Bersulam Putih has a different tone. A shawl with white embroidery is a story woven around the 1908 Mangopor incident regarding the Dutch colonial leverage of land tax on the Minang people. And it is steeped in rich local color and a homage to her native Minang culture. Rentani's indignation towards colonialism is reflected in her writing when Zubaida, her main character, cries out, "Masa sih ini Belanda meminta pajak untuk tanah-tanah pusaka di kampung?" Hebohlah orang kampung waktu itu. Tanah itu bukan tanahnya orang Belanda, tapi tanah turun-menurun kaum orang Minang. How on earth can the Dutch impose a land tax on lands that not even belong to them? Those lands have been owned through generations by the Minang people. Patricia Tanuma Miharja is a food writer. We also have to have nourishment for the body, not just for the soul. Born in Jakarta in 1973, she arrived in the United States in 1992. She has 2 cookbooks to her name. The Asian Grandmother's Cookbook was issued in 2010 and reissued in 2012. Farm to Table Asian Secrets was recently released. Pat came to the United States as a student of the University of Washington in Seattle. Food is Pat's connection to her homeland. And she wrote food articles until she was assigned to write the Asian Grandmother's Cookbook. And when her parents came to the United States in 2002, Pat's mother brought with her the knowledge of Indonesian cuisine and opened an Indonesian restaurant in Seattle. When I spoke with Pat shortly before leaving for this conference, she fondly reflected on what she called her mother's culinary creativity, as she deftly substituted unavailable tropical vegetables with those available at Seattle farm markets. Pat's second book, Farm to Table, Asian Secrets, is a homage to her mother. Pat is currently working hard on an Indonesian cookbook, and she promised that the recipes will be embedded into a narrative that will provide the cook with the story around the dish. And then guess what? There is me. I was born in Jakarta in 1936. I arrived in the United States in the early 60s. Only a Girl is my novel. It was published in 2009 by Publish America and reissued by Dalang Publishing in 2011. When I founded Dalang Publishing, I did not want to experiment with other people's work. And therefore, I bought back the American rights of my own book so I could play with my own book. And if I made mistakes, it's just me, right? While according to the many regular and academic readers, the novel explains the Chinese plight and position in today's Indonesia, I wrote it to tell the story of everyday dynamics between 3 generations of women in a family. Today, I consider Only a Girl the gateway to my homecoming. Rereading my own work after the first flurry of reviews and trying to make sense out of the reviews and the writing, I found several passages that stirred a new sense of consciousness inside me, and I used these passages as road signs on my own journey home. I would like to share with you the one that had the strongest impact on me, as the story sketches the socio-economic political situation of the time. The scene recalls the historical night that Bandung burned. A Chinese family living in a Dutch neighborhood has gone into hiding in an old underground bomb shelter, and there is a power shift between the head of the household and the servant. Ting positioned himself at the shelter's entrance with a gun. Jenny did not ask where the gun came from. There was some rustling by the shelter opening, and Mundi appeared out of the darkness and approached Ting. "They're gone," the servant said. "It looks like they're headed downtown." "How many were there?" Ting asked awkwardly. He was not accustomed to being reliant on a servant in this way. "It's the people, master. The voice of the people is numerous." Mundi's words had an unusual firmness, something none of the family had ever heard before. I'm going to close with the renowned poet Jung Lee. Born in Jakarta in 1950, 1957, Jung Lee arrived in the United States in 1964. Lee has 7 books of poetry to his name, with an 8th one coming in February of next year. Rose, his first book, 1986. The City in Which I Love You, followed 1990. The Winged Seed, A Remembrance, 1995. The Book of My Nights in 2001. Breaking the Alabaster Jar in 2006. From Blossoms in 2007. Behind My Eyes in 2008. And in 2018, in February, I can't wait for that one to come, is The Undressing. Prolific, multi-award-winning poet Jung Lee was born in Jakarta in 1957. His parents came to Indonesia as Chinese political exiles, and his father, who had been a personal physician to Mao Zedong, helped found the Gamaliel University in Jakarta, but was arrested when anti-Chinese sentiment began to form in Indonesia. After he spent a year as a political prisoner, the family fled and arrived in America in 1964. I met Lee several times in San Francisco and Berkeley at readings of his books. Lee's poetry speaks of an intense search for self and a keen awareness of surroundings. It was difficult to choose from the many poems that would fit this occasion. And I finally decided to bring you Lee's Immigrant Blues. The poem, read by Lee himself, is my last offering of Diaspora Voices.
Immigrant Blues. People have been trying to kill me since I was born. A man tells his son, trying to explain the wisdom of learning a second tongue. It's an old story from the previous century about my father and me. The same old story from yesterday morning about me and my son. It's called Survival Strategies and the Melancholy of Racial Assimilation. It's called Psychological Paradigms of Displaced Persons. Called The Child Who'd Rather Play Than Study. Practice until you feel the language inside you, says the man. But what does he know about inside and outside? My father, who was spared nothing, in spite of the languages he used. And me, confused about the flesh and the soul, who asked once into a telephone, "Am I inside you?" "You're always inside me," a woman answered, at peace with the body's finitude, at peace with the soul's disregard of space and time. "Am I inside you?" I asked once, lying between her legs, confused about the body and the heart. "If you don't believe you're inside me, you're not," she answered, at peace with the body's greed, at peace with the heart's bewilderment. It's an ancient story from yesterday evening called Patterns of Love in Peoples of Diaspora, called Loss of the Home Place and the Defilement of the Beloved, called I Want to Sing, but I Don't Know Any Songs.
And with this, I've come to the end of my presentation. I would like again to extend my deepest gratitude to the board of the conference for the opportunity to share my experiences and concerns as an Indonesian diasporan living in America. And I thank everyone in the audience for sustained interest during my talk. And I now invite questions and dialogue from the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Ibu Lian Gouw, for sharing your life journey with us. Now we can learn from the first-hand source, right, about longing and belonging, right, which is not only theories, right, but really what you call it, lived experience. Today we are actually very fortunate because we can learn about the heterogeneity of Indonesian diaspora. Earlier this morning, we had Ibu Erin Cipta, Indonesian migrant worker in Taiwan, who struggled to provide better life for her family, right? And now we just, listen very touching rendition about Ibu Lian's life, right? So it's like two different words. We have diverse pull and push reasons for their diasporan experience. But one thing that really strikes me, these two strong women have something in common. Their love of books, their love of readings, their love of literature, that finally also lead them to be able to write and articulate their story and history. So they are not just impacted by the history, but they can write their own history through words that they created. So this is really impressed me, right? So Bu Arti earlier this morning said that literature, right, will not change the world, right? But literature will change women and men. Then who will change the world? Just like Bu Lian and Bu Erin Cipta, right? So I give opportunity to the floor for questions and answer. So please do. Yes. So okay, we have two doctors from one department. Right? But I would give the first opportunity to Ibu Novi first, and then Pak Paul will be the second. We still have around 25 minutes, so we still have a lot of time. Would you like to also? Please do. Please, Ibu Novi.
Thank you, Bu Sri. Thank you, Bu Lian Gouw, for your inspiring talk. You said that your book made its way to American libraries, and I would like to ask, how did the librarians stack your books? In American novel stack or in Indonesian novel stack? That's
American.
question number one. And American books, yeah? Okay, so I can't call your work Asian literature in English. Can I say that?
Yeah.
Can or cannot?
You can, I think.
But that you are an American novelist or Indonesian novelist?
I'm an American novelist by
Ameri-
passport, yes.
Oh, okay. But the students only know two things: American novels or Indonesian novels.
Yes, so then you need to qualify me as an American writer.
Okay, American novels. So, second question will be something quite personal, though. In the name of identity, do you think that within this context of 21st century global citizenship, is it still important to really to continue pursuing who I am? What is your identity? Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay. So that's the two questions that I would like to ask. Okay.
You have your answers.
Would you like to answer directly and to have more elaboration, or we can wait for the second question, then you can
It's up to you.
Okay.
Okay.
Paul, please do. Yeah.
I've got it. I have one comment and one question. The comment is on your passion for language purity, to make Indonesian not to be contaminated by English vocabularies and so on. It reminds me of an article that I read a while ago. There was such also development of English language. I forgot the name, but this particular senator from the US even proposed a bill to guard English in order not to be contaminated by vocabularies from other languages. But the article says that restraining a language that is developing is like giving birthday gift, but in the form of chastity belt to someone who is actually, dating. And then it turns out that this bill was left untouched, and then as we learn now, English becomes the largest, the only language with the largest vocabulary repositories in the world.
Yeah.
And then what I'm imagining of what Bahasa Indonesia is going to be with this kind of, borrowing loan words and so on. Probably what's going to happen is like also what has happened in English language, that those foreign languages will contribute to the precision, to the nuance that probably, will provide more precision in terms of expressions of one's feelings and so on. Like, for instance, 3 different languages that's very obvious influencing English are French, Latin, and the other one is Anglo-Saxon. They have different nuances. Latin words give you the impression that it is scholarly, that it is academic. French, it is more melodious, it's more romantic. Anglo-Saxon, it's more blunt. So in these nuances, probably then we might also have in Indonesian with this all sort of borrowing. Not necessarily diminishing, but even, I think, developing. That's a comment. And then the question that I have, I was very touched by your reflection, how you experience this sort of post-colonial conversion, when you suddenly feel that, how come I have left my country and then not feeling this sacrifice that my countrymen have sacrificed for the independence and so on.
Country people.
That's very interesting to me, and I would like to know actually what triggers that kind of realization in your life. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pak Paul. Lian?
I guess the very thing that I am fighting so hard, I grew up, as I told you, I grew up with a Dutch mentality. During that time, I didn't feel it, but everyone who spoke Dutch were forced to speak Dutch unless you were Dutch. You were forced. And in order to be respected and accepted, you needed to speak Dutch properly. Dutch is a difficult language. I don't know how many people here do speak Dutch. You have gender of words, and if you mess up you mess up the verbs, and you know it is a big mess. It's not as easy as Indonesian, although I find the meperkan business in Indonesia is very complicated. So, but I try not to mess up. And if you did not use the proper way, then they would look down on you. They would call you names. They would treat you very poorly. You'd think 3 times before you say something that is not proper. And that's why I said, with my Dutch-centric upbringing, I only knew how to speak proper Dutch, because I was not allowed that. So then when we came back here, when I came back in 2010, and I saw that happening, I was shocked. I was totally shocked, because when I left, I couldn't understand what was being said. But now here, there's no one telling us, if you say, saya akan kirim surat kepada Anda, instead of, I akan email you ya nanti. My God, help. God help me. You know, nobody holds a gun against your head or tells us, gonna tell you, you are lesser than them, unless you speak like that, unless you converse in English. It is appalling. From where I come from, it is appalling to see this and experience this. And as I said, I have a very hard time, because I know, because I've seen it, how much blood was spilled for us to be independent. I know what it means not to be allowed to speak a language and be scared. Because if they caught you, some terrible things can happen. Maybe that's why I am so fanatic almost about this. Because I have been struck dumb because I lost my language. Language is a lot more than words. Language is an expression of your deepest deep. Without a language, you do not exist. And that's what I'm afraid of. That first we lose our language. What's next? Are we going to lose our independence again? We are losing our land. Every time you turn around, somebody has bought or invested in our land. What else do we need? Maybe because I'm boarding the train rather late, that I'm stoking the engine. Maybe because I realize how little time I have left to do this, and how many people I can pull their sleeves and say, hey, you, will you please listen and try to understand? Do something about it. It's scary. I am really honest when I say I'm scared. I'm scared. When I see our young people, especially the older people, I can say, well, you know, you're done, so just move on, you know. But it is the young people. It is the young people that I am scared for. Because all they know, it seems, is how to get the next best paying job overseas. And that is sad. It's very, very sad. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah. Okay. Would you like to give more note to Ibu Novi, or would you consider it just enough?
I don't know. What does Ibu Novi?
Would you like to have more elaboration? Oh, okay, okay. Okay, I think that would be.
Yeah.
We still have time for one more round. Please do. Okay, who go? You go.
You go.
You go. You go. You go. Yeah.
You go.
Thank you. You go.
Thank you very much, Bu Lian Gouw. My question is about, it's not quite academic like both my lecture already told to you. I'm not a doctorate yet. Not yet. My question is more personal because maybe you only see one facet of Indonesia through your coming back here in 2010. Maybe you should see more facet of Indonesia. If you remember in Indonesian history, there is the tragedy of 95 or 96. That's the tragedy, 98, yes. That's the tragedy where a lot of people, Chinese people were killed, were massacred and everything. And that's the reason why my family have to move from Jakarta to a more safer place. But that's not my question. My question is about something that I've read in my high school. In my high school, I've read about a short story. And in this short story, it's an Indonesian short story. There's a girl who is being, let's just say, she's in an interrogation room. She has been raped by multiple men. I forgot the short story name. Perhaps it's titled Anna or something like that. Clara, yes, Clara.
Clara, that's fine.
Yes, the Clara. That's the title of the short story. She's been raped multiple times. She isn't being acknowledged as Indonesian, and she has no sense of Indonesia anymore because of that experience. What happens if Clara were alive and Clara she flew to America and to the United States, and you would suddenly appear in front of her and talk to her like she was the audience of here, and then she remembered that buried past, that incredibly painful past. Yes, so what could you say to those kinds of people, the people who escape Indonesia for prosecution? If you say that, if you say that you have to be more Indonesian, but they could say simply because I'm being prosecuted in Indonesia, how can I be Indonesian if in my own home country I am prosecuted? That's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Ibu Lian.
This is a very
Profound question.
touchy, it's almost political, but the way I look at it, and we're both Chinese, yeah? Don't forget that. And Ibu Arti mentioned the Diaspora movement. I'm not a fan of it. People have said, and I'm not trying to promote or push my book, okay? But it is the easiest way to relate, to give you an answer. I didn't know that until someone pointed it out to me. And this person has a PhD, and like me. So when he said that, I started to think. And I thought, you know what? There is a truth in that. And so I did it by accident, but I did it. I wrote it.
in my book, it's about the Chinese family, and it's about colonialization, how it really impregnated that family. And it really shows how the Dutch played that. And the reason also why I am so bitter right now about that time is because I feel cheated. When I published Dasamuka, I was furious. Every time I publish a book, I get angry because I know that history, but it is a different story. Dasamuka, Pangeran Diponegoro was a villain. He was just a no-good piece of scum who made a lot of trouble. That's how I know Pangeran Diponegoro. That's how I was brought up. A lot of the Chinese were privileged because of the Dutch. They played it. In Indonesian, you call it, I guess, adu domba. Yeah? And they were very good at that. The Chinese were the favorites of all the indigenous people. Okay? So, what happens if I like to bring it back to a normal family, any family. You have a mommy and a daddy, and you have 2 children, Betsy and John. Okay? Now, daddy favors John and mommy favors John. Betsy gets terribly pushed out of shape. But she cannot touch little John because guess what? Mommy and daddy are gonna jump on her. Okay? Now, we have the same situation. Mommy and daddy are the Dutch. Okay? John and Daddy are the Pribumi and the Chinese. All right? So the Chinese get elevated all the time. And they play the game. The Chinese, what I was saying about the names, okay? It went way back then. Way back then. I found out later. I didn't know that. Because it didn't happen in my family. But I learned that Chinese could buy for a guilder 50. And that's why the expression China Tunpua comes in. They could buy Dutch national papers. And then instead of Gouw Lian Sim, I would be Lian Sim Gouw. And I would be allowed in the Soos, which is a big building where only Dutch people are allowed. So big deal. I go there, and I sit down, and nobody serves me, and nobody talks to me. But I can go there for $1 guilder 50. Now, does that make me come to my senses? No. Because I feel elevated. Okay? There it starts. The sibling rivalry. Okay, there it's where it starts. I'm not saying that what happened to Clara is right. But I'm not totally saying it is because the Indonesian people are savages. And they have it out for anything and anyone with a yellow skin and slanted eyes. That's wrong. Now, let us roll it back today. You started something. So now you got to listen to this. Today, we are still asking for it. We are still asking for it. How? How? Look around you. And when you come home with me to America, and you see what happens there, who is what, and who drives what, and who talks what, and who wants what. It makes me throw up. Okay? So, yes, I understand. 1998 did not happen to me. I was safe. I didn't even know it happened. Okay? I was oblivious. Because I had turned my back. And when I turned my back, I turned my back. I didn't even know. I knew it after 2/11, when I went home and I learned what was going on. And I still say what I am saying. And I'm in a lot of trouble in the Chinese community for that. Because they say, how can you say that? Well, in a sense, I'm saying it because you are doing what you are doing. That's why. You know? And it will never stop. It will never stop. As long as we have the malls in Jakarta, or wherever in this big place here, and we have people spending money on bags and on shoes that can send a kid to school, that can build a hospital, and you see who does it, we are in trouble. We are in trouble. As long as we have the feeling of they and us, we are in trouble. That's how I made the change. If there's something, then there's many things wrong. And I looked around here before I spoke, because the Chinese issue I will take up, but the other things I won't. Because at the same, I feel very strongly about protecting family. You don't spill the beans or hang out your dirty laundry on the freeway. You know, you just don't. And I'm very much against that. I'm very much against that. I think the only way that we can outlive this is by true assimilation, not by changing our names, not by paying our way, but by actually doing what you're supposed to be doing to first place. You know, people over there, they say, we want to help Indonesia. Really? So what are you giving up? Oh no, because when we do this and this, then we have that kind of business. You're not helping Jack Lantern. What you're doing is making a good business. That's what you're doing. There's a big difference between doing a business, then I expect a return, or when I say I'm going to help you. There is a big, big difference. Look it up in the dictionary if you don't know the language. You know? That's what it is. That's what it is. Did I answer you? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Ibu Lian. I'm afraid that we are running out of time, but from your talk, we learned that we have a lot of thoughts, right? It will be very difficult and it might be very painful, but we have to confront our history and learn from it. Thank you very much, Ibu Lian. Please.
Thank you, Karen.
Ladies and gentlemen, please give another big round of applause for Bu Lian Gouw. Thank you very much, Bu Lian Gouw, for such an inspiring speech about home and identity. As a token of our appreciation for valuable contribution to the conference, may I invite Pak Hirman Wijonarko to kindly present a memento to our speaker and moderator.
Ladies and gentlemen, may I thank you very much for your active participation on the first day of the conference, and I hope you enjoy the program.
We would like to remind all the participants that tomorrow we are going to start the program at 8 a.m. with our third plenary session. Don't forget to recheck the schedule and room where you will present your presentation.
And have a nice day, and
See you on the second day of the Literary Studies Conference 2017.